Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today we're speaking with an on-set sound mixer. His credits are many and include Fargo, Men in Black, and Walk the Line. We're pleased to welcome Peter Kurland. Peter, thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Pete.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here, and it's nice to see you.
We'd like to start with the question, how did you get to where you are today? Were you as a child very conscious of sounds around you? I think your father was a violinist and a music arranger. Did that steer you towards sound? What's your story?
Well, there's like two versions of the story, and the first version is
Which one do you want commonly known?
they're both okay, though the second one is really more true. Yeah,
Okay.
but the first one is, my father was a concert violinist, Juilliard trained, and he also was a music professor. And so when I was a kid, he had tape recorders in the house, which we experimented with, which were really fun. And then later on, he started working in the recording studios. And when he did that, I went to some sessions with him and, got to see how things worked. And so I was a little bit interested, but I was sort of more interested in, movie making. And so he had an 8mm camera, and, my sister started making little films like proto music videos. And I made some as well. And I got sort of an award for one when I was, 10 or 12 years old. And we'd be cutting them on the little mini Steenbeck. And that was fun. And I'd made soundtracks for them as well, which have since been lost to time, although I still have the film. And, I became, a member of a society here that screened classic films and went to a lot of films in high school with friends. But my real interest was theater. And so I was mostly doing theater stuff, and sound was really not a component of it. In fact, when I was first left on my own to do the sound for one particular play, I flipped the wrong switch and blew up the speakers in the middle of the show and deafened the audience. And it was fun for everybody. There was little pieces of speaker cone floating through the air. Anyway, so I went to school and I kind of got interested in other things, firefighting in particular, and some other things, and sort of came out a little bit unsure of what I wanted to do. And here's where the second version of this comes in, which is really the true thing, which is, I was working in a little theater upstairs from my mother's store. She had a building with a couple of floors, and one of the floors was a theater. And, my wife was designing sets and I was helping. And a location manager, Debbie Reinisch, went into her store and said, "Hey, we're shooting a TV movie in town. Do you know anybody who wants to be a production assistant?" And my mother said, "Oh, you should speak to, my son and his girlfriend. They're upstairs." And so she came up and said, "Come over and talk to us about," she came to talk to us about what we might be interested in doing, and said we should come down and meet with the producer and see if there were jobs for us, which was very exciting. And Shannon immediately got hired as a location assistant. And they said to me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Oh, I was thinking about theater things. I thought about I'd like to do props maybe, or work, do set construction." And they said, "Really, there aren't any of those jobs. Do you know anything about sound?" And I said, "Not really." And they said, "Do you know what an Agra is?" And I said, "Never heard of it." And they said, "Great, you're hired."
Perfect.
And I guess they had there was a mixer on that show who, really wanted an assistant. It was a TV movie, but there was a lot of music playback. And he wanted somebody, and they didn't want to hire somebody, so they figured they would get him somebody, and that was me. So I did this one TV movie, which was really fun, and I learned a lot because there's a lot of playback in it. And the show was over, and this location manager who Shannon was working with went down to Texas to be the first AD on Blood Simple, the Coen's first movie. And
Oh,
so I went down with her thinking I'm going to get a job, but I had, really no skills and no experience. And Lee Orloff, who was the mixer, had not hired a boom operator yet, and they had no money. And so when I came in, they said, well, do you think you can boom operate? And I said, I don't know. I've seen it done once. I should be able to figure it out. And
wow.
and then as I remember, we didn't, I practiced with a closet pole from my apartment that we were renting. And then, I met Lee, and as I recall, it was Ethan who I followed around the room with a closet pole, and that we started shooting like a day afterwards.
Wow.
Wow.
I know when you started out, we should point this out. You grew up in Nashville, right? Which is where you are now.
Yes, I'm in Nashville now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing that you boomed a movie without really knowing how to boom a movie. That's amazing.
Well,
Did anybody else on the film know what they were doing?
Oh, well, that's probably true too.
Barry Sonnenfeld, the DP, was his first 35 millimeter movie. It was Joel and Ethan's first movie. There were some really good experienced people. The key grip, Tom Profit, who had been around for decades. There were some other experienced people, but most of us, it was our first movie. And I think we did pretty well. Barry's eyesight had never been great. And he was learning to use the eyepiece on the Arri BL, which apparently you have to press your eye really hard and it's hard to see the whole frame.
Yeah.
So he said, look, I'm not going to be able to see whether you're in frame or not. You're going to have to really help me. And I said, well, you're going to have to help me too. And, we felt our way through it together.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the hardest things when you're booming too, is knowing what the frame is. And over the years, you must be able now, if they say, oh, it's a 50, look at where the camera is and where the actor is and know what the edge of the frame
we're
is,
talking
right?
about Blood Simple. This is way before video playback and all that.
Yeah, and you need to know lens sizes, and you also need to know, what the typical composition is for the operator, because some people give just naturally more headroom, or they like to tilt up at various points and look at other things, and so it took a while to learn that. And the hardest thing I think is because I'm left-handed, and when I first started, I could, there's left-handed booming and right-handed booming, and I had to learn to do both, because wherever you're standing, which usually it's preferable if you're out of the key light.
Yes.
Then you have to be on the other side, and you still have to be able to look at the camera so you can see what's going on. And it's particularly hard if there's zoom lenses. I mean, this wasn't the case with the Coens, who use mostly primes, but with zoom lenses, you have to sort of be able to see when they've zoomed out, because you'll get caught.
Yeah. And also, don't you, because I know as a script supervisor, this is what I did. You watch the actors rehearse, and actors sometimes give a tell before they stand up, for instance, their shoulder twitches or whatever. So I would always look for that, because then I would know when they were going to stand up. And
that's the only way to do it, because you can learn all the dialogue.
Yeah.
And even so, the actors aren't necessarily going to say the words as written. They might miss a cue. One of my most horrifying moments as a boom operator was when I lost where I was in the dialogue, and I pointed at the wrong actor, and they didn't have a line, but they knew that they were supposed to speak. They assumed I knew the script. So I think they had to make something up.
Yeah. Well, so then when you're booming, especially when you have a scene where they're going to tilt up with them when they're standing or whatever, you have to watch the actor and the camera at the same time. Are you able to do that, one eye this way, one eye that way?
Yeah.
Can you teach us?
Yeah, you have to watch the whole set, because sometimes there's lights that are moving and handheld flags, and you have to keep an eye on everything. And there's other challenges. There's various people who are trying to be on set and be able to see what's going on. They'll always end up directly behind the boom operator, and then suddenly you realize you have to take a step backwards, and you have to do it without killing somebody, because frankly, killing people makes noise, and that will affect the track.
Yeah, that's the only problem. Yeah. And also, as a boom operator, you need not to be a distraction to the actor. So you have to, I would think, learn a way that you're not irritating the actor for sure, but you're able to not throw them in any way.
Well, exactly. And you have to be able to look them basically in the face to be able to see if they're getting ready to speak and,
Yeah.
see if there's head turns and stuff. And you have to do it at the same time without catching their eye. Because if you
Yeah.
catch their eye, it's very difficult for them for performance.
Mhm.
And what I learned in my career is that I thought I was a pretty good boom operator, and I was very lucky. I got a lot of good jobs. But when I became a mixer and I worked with good boom operators, then I learned there's a lot of stuff too with the job that I had no idea that I wasn't doing.
It must have. I mean, I think your first 4 films were boom operating on Coen Brothers films. Yeah.
I think that's right. I was also doing a lot of other stuff in between. After Blood Simple, I did a few movies with Lee in New York, some more or less, sometimes without movies, sometimes without a budget. And so there was a lot to be learned, and it was always just him and me. We never had an assistant, and I don't think I did. A lot of them I didn't get paid. In fact, I think the next movie I did is a movie called Marie. The next movie I did for money was a movie called Marie. It was a Roger Donaldson movie, and I wanted to be the utility guy on it. And I didn't have enough experience, and they didn't want to hire me. And they came to Nashville. It was only supposed to be there for a couple of weeks, but they agreed to hire me to do sound effects recording for them. So I had a stereo Nagra, and I could record stereo effects. And we were shooting in and out of the Tennessee State Prison, and there was all kinds of great, ambiances and jail door effects and stuff that they wanted. And I did that. And one day they called me and said, "Are you coming into work today?" And I said, "Well, of course." And they said, "No, you got to come to the set." And I said, "Well, what am I going to record on the set?" And they said, "Well, you're the mixer now." And apparently,
Oh wow.
Oh my God.
David Hilliard, a fantastic multi-Academy Award-winning sound mixer, he'd had a heart attack, and he couldn't come in. And they knew I know how to use a Nagra, and so I was their guy.
Oh my God.
So even before I boomed my second feature, I was mixing, and
Oh wow.
I mixed for I think 6 weeks, and they were done in Nashville, and David hadn't come back to work, and they had me go down to North Carolina. I moved down there for a little while, which is where I learned how to recognize a brute that needed oil. And
A brute arc, you mean?
yes, and then David came back miraculously, which was fantastic. But I also learned a lot of boom operating there because the boom operator David Pearson, he worked in the British style, which is I guess is no headphones and very little communication. And so you had to really be on your toes because at any moment David could say, "Okay, roll now for a slate," and I flip the thing on it. He'd give a slate, and then he'd start doing the scene, and I tried to keep up.
Did you do you think you became a better boom operator after doing that mixing job?
Oh, I'm sure I did. I mean, every job I learned a lot, but that was my first time working with well, it's not my first job with another boom operator because Mark John Sullivan boomed the TV movie I did, but it was my first job where I was critically listening to it, and there was a lot to be learned about, background noise and whether it's handling noise, and trying to keep track of things. And frankly, he did most of it on that movie, which really made it an easy learning experience for me. And because David Hilliard was already in his late 60s when he did that movie, they were used to doing everything for him, rolling his cart and handing him things, and he had a really easy life. And I thought, oh, that's I don't know what's going to be like to work at that age, but it's nice that everybody does everything for you. And then I just did a movie, and I'm as old as he was then, and I'm still pushing my own cart and carrying all my own
It's
cases.
not like that, really.
Yeah, the early movies, we think, this is what the film business is going to be like, and then, oh boy.
And then Lee and I did a movie in New York called Bingo Madness, I think, which was David O. Russell's first movie. It was a short film.
Oh wow.
Wow.
And about halfway through, I got a call from the Coens and said, we were looking to maybe hire another boom operator. Are you willing to come in? And I felt a little bad about it because Lee hadn't gone back. They'd hired a different mixer because of the IA issues. So I went down there to boom operate, but my plane got held up in a storm, and I had to spend the night, I think, in Texas or something. Meanwhile, Alan Beyer, the mixer, his father died, and so he flew home. So and this is before cell phones. So when I arrived on set, again, I was the mixer, not the boom operator. It was,
Oh,
Oh
wow.
my gosh.
Oh, wow.
so I was a little bit forced in that direction, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. The universe kept telling you
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is your path, and you're going, no, I'm going to boom this movie.
Yeah, but-
How much changed between the Blood Simple experience and this is Raising Arizona we're talking about, right?
Right. It was very different. For one thing, it was a union movie, and there's a lot of things that change about
Yeah.
how that works. There was,
Were you in the union at that time?
I was not, which was a little bit of a problem, and that's its own story. But it was very professionally done. We had a lot more, for a Coen movie, we had a lot more time and a lot more money.
Mm-hmm.
Which is still not much, but yeah. Was your process any different?
As a boom operator,
Hmm.
not that I recall. I will say that, it's Joel and Ethan, since the very beginning, were very big on, preparation and storyboards and, sticking to the script and all the things that they continue to do. So even though there was more staff and there was more opportunity to hand out paperwork and stuff, that from a working perspective, it was really very similar. The difference is that, I had access to a rental car, which I didn't on the first one.
Yes. So it's nice.
It must be a nightmare when you're working on a film where they encourage improvisation, because you don't know who's speaking next or what they're going to say and when they're finished with it.
Yeah, I got kind of lucky because I didn't start doing any of those movies until I was a mixer, and then it really became, the boom operator's problem.
Well, that's interesting. So how does it split then between the recordist and the boom operator in terms of what system you use? I mean, radio mics started becoming much more popular, didn't they, in the 80s? So I guess maybe you were starting to use them more, and place microphones. I remember starting and people just boomed, and then other sound recordists would use a lot of radio mics, and then gradually there would be a lot of place mics, and then there would be multiple tracks. So you would have boom mics and radio mics and place mics, and they'd all be separated on the recordist's mixer. So how does that split between what the boom operator is suggesting and the recordist?
Well, I am such a huge fan of the sound of the boom that
Yeah.
I'll stick with the boom as a single mic on set for as long as I
And
possibly
for
can.
what reason? Can you explain why would
That
you go
sound.
down that direction sound wise? What does it give you that doesn't a radio mic doesn't?
Well, for one thing, it sounds like a person because you got a microphone that's generally pointing at you. It has similar perspective to what you would feel like if you were in the room.
Right.
A radio mic, it's like listening to somebody with your head on their chest. And it's very hard to lose that sense of it. You get no sense of the room. And I know in post, they can add ambience in, they can try to take some of the muffling out of the way the radio mic sound, but even a well-placed radio mic, it just doesn't sound as good as a boom. And people's voices mix in the air really well. And so if you have two people talking, rather than switching back and forth between them, and then you get phase problems, and it's really hard if you don't make the cue just right. It sounds all weird. Even if the boom operator is slightly behind, which I was happy to work with some great boom operators who never got behind. But even if they do, it sounds good as it's approaching the right spot, as opposed to a radio, which is if it's not working, it's not working. And I don't know what it is. There's an instinct in actors, which is to gesticulate by putting their hands on their chest. And wherever wherever you put the microphone, that is the place they want to grab, usually in the most emotional moment of the scene that you want to lose the least. And that just doesn't happen with a boom. It's not an issue with a boom.
Yeah.
But do editors want, I mean, would there be an editor maybe who would want more separated tracks? Because with a boom, like you say, you're hearing the other person.
Well, here's what I did, and I think I learned this from Alan Beyer. I started using two booms for almost every scene, and there'd be one boom on the person who's usually in front of camera. But if there was somebody who was off, or if it was an over, then if there's too much distance between them for one mic, you just mic the other side, and then in post they can checkerboard it. They can get the balance the way they want it, and if there's an overlap, it's nowhere near as much of a problem. And that also allows, to a certain point, it allows the actors to set their own timing in the dialogue. It's a much more natural way for them to speak to each other. And for some directors, that's fantastic. And for some directors, they'd much rather cut the timing themselves to try to get something different out of the performance.
Yeah.
So it's really, it's a matter of taste, I guess. And certainly if there's a lot of noise, or the shots are wide, or it's a difficult situation, you have to go to radio mics. And as long as the radio mics are on there, I'll leave them on, and I'll record a track for each actor as long as they're wearing a microphone. But usually, often at times they don't get used.
Do you also hide mics in the set?
Oh yeah,
if you can.
Yeah, I did a movie called Full Moon and Blue Water, which was a Gene Hackman movie, and there was one particular shot where they were in this. It's sort of a nightclub restaurant thing. It had all kinds of complications. There were fishnets hanging from the ceiling. That was the set decoration. And there was a bar that he went behind, and he had to go through a doorway. And it was a very long scene that played, in one. And so we had, there's no way to swing a boom in there. So this is, I was boom operating. I do my best to keep up, but we had microphones everywhere, as many as the mixer owned, and he had more microphones than he had inputs on his mixer. So our cable person would be there plugging and unplugging things to
Wow.
in between lines, and it worked great.
Wow.
And I guess now that movie was in the mid '80s, and I guess these days you just put a radio mic on and be done with it. But famously, Gene does not like to wear a radio mic, so you reserve that for when you're absolutely desperate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, does different actors have different kind of ways of working? I mean, are some more put off by having a boom over their head than others? And I mean, then there's the actors that mumble because they want to do all their performance in post sync, maybe because they get paid twice or something, whatever. I don't know.
I found more actors who don't want to wear a radio mic than I found actors who find the boom distracting, although I've seen both. And there's some actors who absolutely refuse. And, I won't mention any names, but, one of them was in No Country for Old Men. And I did 4 movies with him. And it was a big deal. If he had to wear a wire, there was like a conference on set, and the director was involved, and he would, if you convinced him that it was absolutely necessary, he would do it. But that usually came with, you have 30 seconds. So
yeah. Oh well, we all know who you're talking about. Really, he's a lovely man, but he can be grumpy.
Yeah. And I don't blame him. I mean, it's very you're walking around with something. These days it's lighter, but early on, the radio mic packs were really heavy. Most actresses don't like them because they make weird lumps in their clothing.
Yeah.
And I saw Blood Simple recently, and it just drives me crazy because there's one scene where I can actually see the lavalier on Fran. And, we did the best that we could, but, in the early 80s, the lavaliers were quite large.
Right. Well, now do they paint them out? Do you have that same problem? I mean, I don't know. Has it changed because of digital technology? Can you? I mean, I can leave a light in shot.
Yeah, I know.
Can you leave a mic in shot? Oh, I mean, one sound recordist we were working with said, well, I can leave the booms in shot, can I? Because they can be painted out. And of course, I freaked. I mean, because I like the frame to be as pristine as possible, you know me. But but how has it changed?
With all due respect, Roger, that's the problem. If you ask for it, they're going to do it. If I ask for it, they're going to laugh and laugh. We do, if we're doing green screen stuff, it's easy to have the boom in. because it's an easy slot mat to do. And I know, this has not happened to me, but on other shows, particularly musicals, where it's really important to get the track perfectly, I know that they've planned in advance to leave the lavalier in frame and then paint it out. But like you say, most people don't want to go to that trouble. It's cheaper than it used to be, but it's not free, and it's just more work to be done. And if you have the time to do it, it's great. But if you're working on a project with limited resources or limited turnaround time, they're not going to even contemplate doing that.
Yeah. And do you find nowadays too, because there's so many different deliverables, and so we end up protecting such a big frame when normally it would be 239, but they're going to deliver in IMAX, so we need to protect up here. So the boom gets further and further away. How do you deal with that?
Well, I would like to say that the best thing to do is to only take movies that are shot in scope, because then you really
there you go.
have no headroom at all.
Good luck finding them.
Yeah. But, that was one interesting thing about Blood Simple is, it was shot full frame, 133, but it was with the intention of matting it to 185 for projection. But, they didn't do a hard mat. So when you see that movie on TV, sometimes I can see how good of a job I did boom operating. I can see if I'm pointing in the right place. You can see the dolly track and the lights and, all that kind of stuff, which I find fascinating. And, in some of the shots, some of those things are just in frame, even in 185, but they look natural in there. So, nobody ever said, oh, look, that scene was ruined because you could see pipe dolly. They just assumed it was part of the scenery.
Yeah. The famous shot in Opening of Fat City that Conrad Hall shot, where on TV you see the tracks as the camera pulls back from the motel. And that's silly because when I was shooting in the UK to start with, you always had a hard mat. If you were shooting 185, you would put in a 166 hard mat. So that always gave sound recordists and, tracks, everything you could put is really quite close to the frame. But then in America, it was like, no, because we want to show full frame on TV, which is the same as then now you do a film in, widescreen, but they still want the option of IMAX, and it's really frustrating.
Well, that goes exactly to that problem, which is if full frame is being protected, then your microphone's going to be much farther away than you want it to be, and either you have to use a longer microphone, or eventually, if it's serious enough, you have to go to radios.
Right.
Radios are their own problem, though, because let's just say that the technology was perfect and the microphone was in exactly the right spot and the clothing worked and all of those things, and the actor was willing to, to go along with it. There's a huge problem with spectrum. They've sold off all the spectrum in the radio mic bands, and so they keep cramming more and more stuff into the smaller and smaller band. And now you go to set, and all the lighting is wirelessly controlled, and the camera is wirelessly controlled. And there used to be no walkie channels. Then there was one, and now there's 16. And each one of those elements that comes in just eats up space in the spectrum and multiple channels of video transmitting. And so, trying to find radio mics that'll fit in that becomes more and more difficult. And the technology keeps evolving. I use digital radio mics where they can fit in a much smaller spot, and it's harder to interfere with them. But, even with that, the problem with those is that they don't make noise. Either they're perfect or there's nothing. So you're kind of hoping for perfect.
Yeah, I forget there's all those bandwidth kind of problems.
Well,
I remember I had a problem I think it was on Hudsucker, when the camera would pan without me touching it, and we found it was when the AD was standing too close with his Motorola, it was cueing the remote head to pan.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like
yeah. Well, on 1917 too, we had, because it was such long scenes and we were so far away, we had so much connectivity we had to deal with, and we all had to sit around and figure out who's on what channel and who's using what in the spectrum. It was quite difficult.
Yeah, and now they on a lot of movies they're hiring frequency coordinators for that reason. Particularly.
Oh, wow.
Particularly, I think it came about mostly in Atlanta, where there'd be Marvel movies shooting, and they just huge movies with multiple cameras and
Interesting.
complicated setups, and so somebody had to come in and figure all that stuff out, because it's not just enough. I mean, I'm not an expert on RF propagation, but it's not just enough to not be on the same frequency. You have to not be on the harmonic, and you have to not be in the guard bands. And by the time you're done, if you look at the frequency analysis of a set, it's like a solid block of radio transmission. And if you're trying to find a spot, I mean, I had a problem on No Country. They're out in the desert on the horses, and suddenly, for some reason, I still don't understand why, my radio reception dropped to about 5 feet. And Betsy Magruder, is very, very, very extremely protective of horses. And so she will not let a boom be used around the horse, even if that horse has been around booms its whole life. And so Randy couldn't boom. So instead, he boomed the radio antenna, and he always kept it, sort of out of the horse's eye line, and did all the same skills he normally uses. It was just to get radio reception. But you could. There's a radio glitch in that scene that made it into the movie, and it works. It sounds like some sort of tack jingling or something, but I know what it is, and it.
I was going to ask you on that film. Early on in prep, I remember Joel saying to me, something to think about is there's going to be no music. There's not going to be no music track. Do you remember that? Did that change the way
you approached it?
You approached the film at all?
Well, when I did Marie, I think the editor met with me at the very beginning, and he said, "Look, here's the most important thing you should know: record everything, even if you don't need it. Record everything." And I always try to do that, and Joel and Ethan really don't like that because it's complicated. It's an extra couple of people on the set, but I do it anyway.
Yeah.
So I recorded a lot of production effects and ambiances and little utterances and stuff, even in scenes without dialogue. And I think they used a lot of it. Although, on that movie, Craig Berkey was the sound effects designer, and they went in and they took all my tracks, which I thought were pretty clean, but they had wind on them because you've shot in New Mexico, it's 40 mile an hour winds every day. So you hear the wind, and they went through carefully and removed all the wind from all the tracks. And then Craig went back in and put in different wind that he felt suited the mood of the scene better. So it was that, that movie was very carefully scored. It just wasn't scored with music.
Right.
But I recorded everything I could. There was a day, I don't know if you were aware of this, but we were shooting on the top of that hill in Taos, I think. It was where he's pulling the bullet out of his shoulder, or pulling the wadding out of his shoulder, and there's no dialogue. And everybody went off in a splinter unit, and everybody jumped into a van and left. And I said, "Well, we got to record sound on this." And they said, "Well, there's no room for the van. You got to go. We're going to go." So, Randy and I commandeered another van and took my sound cart, which at that point, even taken to its smallest part, was about 150 pounds because it had a big lead acid battery in it. And while you guys were setting up, we were scaling that hill on foot, carrying the sound cart, 2 feet at a time. And we got there in time to roll and put the boom in. And, and Josh is, making groaning, and you hear the sound of the stuff tearing.
Yeah.
It was really great. And as best I could tell, that's in the movie. And that was,
I remember that.
And that was totally against the wishes of, well, certainly Betsy and definitely Joel and Ethan.
Yeah, they're minimalist, very minimalist, but then they want these things anyway.
Well, especially after.
And it, don't you? So sometimes it's like, you're kind of arguing with them, but really that they want what you're saying, to be done.
I was just going to say that my philosophy about Joel and Ethan, and they always want the sound to be perfect. They want all the dialogue perfect. They don't want a loop. They don't want problems. They don't want, overlap in the wrong places. But they don't want to think about it, and they don't want to have to do it. They don't want to have to do anything about it. And they will probably see this differently. They'll probably say, "I ask all the time for stuff," but I feel like I ask for like 1 out of 100 things because they just don't want to have to deal with it. But I feel like it's my responsibility to try to get the tracks that I know they want, even if they don't know they want them.
Yeah, but isn't that the case with a lot of directors? They don't want to know about the issues you have, the challenges of a particular location. I mean, even with Joel and Ethan, we would go and look at a location, and I might once say, well, the problem with this for me technically, but they don't really want to know that. So you say it once in passing, and then you put it to production, and then you deal with it through production, don't you? But I don't think that's any different with any director, really, because they're just concentrating on what they're concentrating on.
Well,
fair enough.
The difference is, in my experience, because I try to keep the interruptions to a minimum, if I say to them, this is really a problem, then they'll take the time to maybe let me do it, as long as it's not more than a couple of minutes. But they'll give me a chance to fix stuff, and a lot of directors won't. And but there's other issues I don't have to deal with, which is multiple cameras becomes a real problem, and the combination, which I'm sure you've heard this before, but if you have a wide lens and a tight lens at the same time, the headroom's different, and you can't get the perspective right for either of the shots. And Joel and Ethan really don't do that. They never have a second camera up unless it's a stunt or some other odd situation.
Yeah, no, I find it. I've only a few times worked with a director who wanted multiple cameras on a dialogue scene, and you got like 5 people sitting around a table, and I think, well, okay, you're doing one shot on a kind of 28, and then you've got cameras on 135 mils or even longer, and you think, well, it's hard enough for me to light it and get the shot that I really want. Well, I never can. You can't. Let's face it. You're never going to get it. But then, how do you mic it? Then you're forced to use radios, right? You can't do anything else.
Yeah, forced to use radios, and that doesn't even always solve the problem. And it suddenly ties you to the sound for the worst shot, because unless there's the ability to use the close-up sound on the boom and lay that into the wider shots, then everything ends up having to be radio mics, good or bad, for everything. And if that were to happen with Joel and Ethan and a couple of other directors, I could say to them, here's the problem, and they would fix it. And some directors, they don't want to think about it, but they don't want to do anything about it, even when it's brought to their attention as a real problem.
And also, if you've got people around a table, and let's say it's a dinner scene, and they've got radio mics on, aren't you hearing all the chewing?
Well, you hear chewing. You're suddenly you've got a microphone that's incredibly close to the silverware and the plates and all that kind of stuff. And then but dinner scenes are impossible anyway, and that's why
you shouldn't have them in movies, really.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We should go home that day.
Yeah, that's why a really, really good utility person is so important, because they will say, oh, I was looking at the script last night and I see they're eating here, and so I've gone in early and I've put rubber rings around the bottom of each plate, and I've worked with the prop department. We've substituted all the silverware for, and they solve these problems, right down to rubber ice cubes if necessary. It's more things than I could think about. So you have the whole department is working to try to solve those problems. But dinnerware is hard. In fact, going back to Marie again, one of the first scenes I mixed was a dinner scene, and I didn't know any of that stuff. And so we got to dailies, and it turned out that the recording levels I used were much, much louder than the ones that David used. And so we got to dailies my first day, and all you can hear in dailies is just banging and clanking and slopping of food. It was deafening. And so I learned, record low, and now with digital stuff you can record super low, and my settings are always very low.
Good to know. And you mentioned about talking with the director. So I'm not a director, I'm sorry, with an editor, talking with an editor. And obviously Joel and Ethan edit themselves, but with another situation where there is a separate editor in prep, do you spend a lot of time talking to them, and what do you talk to them about?
If I can, I did a movie called Legend of Bagger Vance, and it was actually the assistant editor, Liza, who I spoke to frequently, and she would say, we're cutting a scene from last week, and there's a thing the golf ball does, these effects that we would like to have, and can you get those for us? And so throughout the whole show, she would tell me what they needed, and I would go out and get it. So that was really good. And in return for which, I spent a fair amount of time in the cutting room and got to see how they were dealing with the sound. Each time I do something like that, and I try to go to every mix, I learn more about what works and what doesn't, and what's worth taking time about and what's not. And it's not always easy when you're shooting. And now, it's very rare, I think, these days to actually have the editor on location. And so there's very little
Mhm.
opportunity to do that. But I learned a tremendous amount, going into the cutting room or going to the mix.
It's also the feedback that you get from an editor during shooting because you're out there shooting, but they've got this time, they're looking at everything and they're thinking ahead how it's going to cut. I end up talking a lot of times talking with the editor just to get feedback because you want to know that you're on the right path, that you're working within their concept of the cut.
Certainly, I deal with a certain amount of that, and if I get a chance to speak to editors, we will have that discussion. Do you want the off-camera mic'd? How do you want to deal with overlaps? Those kind of things we plan up front. But oftentimes, once you've developed a rhythm with somebody, you just don't have the chance, and you just do what you've learned from them, and you hope it all works out.
And then our telephone conversations, isn't that always a discussion? How do you want to handle this? Are you recording the other actor first? Is the actor off camera? How?
I've been in business long enough that there was at least a long time where there was no possibility of the phone conversations from set. No
Hmm.
cell phones and often no phone available on location. So you kind of have to learn to wing it. But
Hmm.
I do have I have conversations before and during each movie with Skip Leafsay, who's the
Hmm.
supervising sound editor and the dialogue mixer for Joel and Ethan's movies, and
Hmm.
he'll say, can you concentrate on this or could you try to get that? And I will do my best. But
Hmm.
Skip it's a fantastic mixer and sound editor, but he hasn't spent a huge amount of time on set. So he will ask me for things
Right.
that if you spend a lot of time on set, particularly with Joel and
Hmm.
Ethan, you realize no, they're not going to sit still for impulse sound recording. I
Yeah.
can't remember the last time I recorded room tone because there's just not going to they're just not going to want to do it. I can go back
Yeah.
later and get it. It's not the same thing. So, I try to honor the requests from post as best as I can, but oftentimes, for practical reason, that's impossible.
How often have you run a scene, asked the director to run a scene just for sound? I mean, I remember, especially more early in my career, I suppose, shooting a scene and then them playing it just for the sound of it to get the actors' voices clear.
Yeah, I've done that a few times. I mean, I certainly do a lot of wild lines, and sometimes that turns into you say, well, as long as you're doing this, can we take 30 seconds and just do all the lines of the scene? But that requires the crew being quiet. And once you've got a print on the setup, they're not going to wait to move the track and reset the lights and go and get snacks and stuff. Sure, you're recording sound, but you never get the same kind of lockup that you do
Hmm.
when the camera's
Mm.
running. I mean,
Hmm.
there's
Hmm.
two people I have to thank for a lot of clean dialogue I've recorded, and one of them is Barry Sonnenfeld as a director because he's very sensitive to background noise, and so he likes a set to be very quiet when we're shooting. He will make really good care to make sure that there's no background sounds, and doors are shut, and ballasts are turned off. And the other one is Roger is you because you like a quiet set, and you find
Oh my God, yeah.
you find those distracting noises really bad. So people are not going to make the same kind of noise, on a set for you that they are for a lot of sets, and that helps a lot.
Hmm.
Well, and speaking of Barry, what wasn't one of your first big mixing jobs the Adams Family?
Yeah, no, Barry, when he became a director, invited me to mix, which was really my first big studio movie, and boy, that was a big learning curve.
I'll bet.
That was also, that was where I met Steve Bowerman, who was the boom operator. Very imposing gentleman. He's taller than I am. I think he's smarter than I am, and he's certainly 1,000 times better of a boom operator than I was. And so I learned to really rely on him, and he got a lot of stuff done. But it was also a complicated movie. We shot a lot of stuff off speed that we wanted to have be in sync. We had a lot, yeah,
Really?
we had a lot of actor availability issues. So we got to where we'd play back one actor to the other off camera if the actor wasn't available to perform. And there were a lot of effects things we had to deal with. So
Mm.
a huge learning curve, but it was also a show with a budget. So when you said, "Hey,
Yeah.
can we do this?" They could. So that was kind of great.
How do you record something that's off speed that they want in sync?
Well, at that time, if you were shooting at 22 frames, then you would put in a request to the transfer house and you said, we want to transfer this audio at 22 frames. And then it all sunk up. That was the first movie where I used a digital recording. And so for that, they would actually slow it down digitally, and they could do the same thing. Actually, in this case, speeding it up, because when we shot stuff that was affected, it would be 22 frames. And we say, okay, well, that's such a percentage, and can you transfer this at that speed higher? And it worked great. I did not know how much that cost to do, and I think if the production manager had known as I was making that request, I probably wouldn't have been allowed to do it. But it was really good for dailies, because they could really judge something because it's in sync.
Yeah, exactly. You were just about to say something.
No, I just wondered what else from the Addams Family. What was that the biggest challenge on it? I mean,
We heard it was a tough movie.
Yeah, was it a shock going on to something so large? I mean, you've worked on every Coen Brothers film in the last 25 years, right? Is it always like kind of comforting to go back to work with them because they're so prepared? And how different was it on a large production like the Addams Family?
Well, it was similar in a lot of ways because, Barry started with the Coens. He used a lot of the same techniques. He storyboarded, he shot listed. He's always very prepared. And so from that perspective, it was very similar. I think, what was hard about it was just, the number of effect shots, the complications of some of those things. And it was just new technology to learn. And that was much more apparent on a movie like Wild Wild West, for example, where we shot a lot of stuff on robotic cameras and motion control. And those things really became a technical challenge to learn to work with. And the scope, the other thing, I guess, is the scope. There's a scene in Addams Family where there's a walk and talk in the cemetery. And if I recall, it was shot on a huge stage, and I can't remember if it was stage 27 at Sony or stage 6, probably stage 16 at Warner Brothers, but there were 100 HMIs on set, and all the ballasts were in the ceiling, but they were electronic ballasts, and so they had fans. So at any given point, there was a deafening amount of fan noise. And Barry called me and he said, "I want you to come in and listen to this." And I went and listened to him, and I knew how loud Angelica spoke, and I said, "Yeah, this is going to be a problem. I mean, you can do it, but it's going to be a problem." And he wanted to use the boom too. He likes the way the boom sounds, and so he said, "Oh, we'll have it fixed." And this was late in the afternoon one day, and we came in the next morning, and they had built little dog houses around each one of the ballasts, and each dog house had an air conditioner in it so that between takes they could cool the ballasts, and it was all controlled by the studio lights and bells. And I don't know how much that cost to do and how many crew people it took. It saved a day of shooting, in this, that otherwise we would have lost those scenes. But that's kind of scary to make a suggestion and then have all this time and money to be spent on it. And that wouldn't, if I said that to Joel and Ethan, they would just laugh and say, "Well, yeah, we're not going to do that." But
no, I was going to say, it would be a different thing. I mean, you have to judge, don't you? Just like I have to judge the kind of lighting I'm going to do on a Fargo as opposed to on a True Grit. I had much more flexibility on True Grit because I knew it was a larger budget and we had a bit more time. But there's still a level. I mean, how do you make those decisions when you go to a location, say, as there's a tin roof or whatever, how do you make that decision whether to ask to cover it in a horsehair or whether you do say, "Look, this location's going to be a real problem for me for a set of reasons. Can we find somewhere else?" How do you make those judgments?
Well, I do it the only way I know how to do, which is to see whether the scene is going to work. And if I determine that there's no way the dialogue is going to be usable in that scene, I'm not going to be the one that says, "Oh, we can't shoot here," or you have to make these changes. But I do feel like it's my responsibility to tell the director and the production manager, these are the things that are going to be problems, and they say, "Well, what can we do about it?" And I can make suggestions, but ultimately it's their decision about what they want to do about it. And sometimes they'll do things and sometimes they won't. And sometimes it works out. I mean, we've shot places where we had them put hog hair on the entire roof because it was going to be the cover set, and we knew it was likely to rain. And then
Yeah.
and then it never rains.
Never rains.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and sometimes, certainly there were scenes that we shot in the ski area in Santa Fe where there's the stream babbling over everything, and they're not supposed to be near a stream. And so, I said, we got to put hog hair in the stream, and they said, that's crazy. You don't want to do that, but it's not that expensive, and they do it, and it makes it possible to save the performances.
Mm.
Mm.
That's totally what it's about, is the performances. If you want to save the performance and not have to have it looped or not have to make some sort of change, then you just have to present that to the director, and the director can make the decision. Oh, well, that's something that they can loop, or that actor likes to loop, or we're not going to use that part of that shot anyway, which is Joel and Ethan's sort of specialty, is they know what they're
Yeah.
gonna save and what they're not. And so if I say, well, we can't use that take because of this or that, they'll say, oh, we're not going to use that part, and they know. Most directors don't
Mhm.
know that.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mm. Mm.
It made me laugh when you said that you put the thing over the roof and then it didn't rain, because then what happens is production comes to you and says, well, see, we knew you never needed it,
Yeah,
but
really.
it was a good thing to have because you could have needed it. But it's just funny. It made me laugh. And what about, you've done a number of things shooting with playback. We've done, Oh Brother that had a playback, and Walk the Line had a lot of playback. Can you tell us what's entailed in that?
Yeah, and when is it playback and when is it live? I mean, they kind of interesting. I mean, on Oh Brother, for instance, the Chain Gang opening, I can't remember with that playback. It must have been playback, but where does it vary from one to the other?
Well, actually, that opening scene in Oh Brother, it was playback, but we recorded live vocals on each featured singer, so that afterwards they could mix their voice in, so they would seem more present, and it would be in better
Hmm.
sync. So, Oh Brother
Right.
was just sort of, it was filled with sort of half playback, half live stuff like that, where we do silent playback. Down to the river to play. We had, I don't know how many, 200 people in the river, but we seated 20 of them with playback tracks to keep them in sync. So in each there'd be it's like black sheep in a shepherd's field. In any given area, there's one person who's got a sync reference. But we did a million things. We were inventing technology on Oh Brother because I'd done a couple of different movies with music and playback before that, starting from that very first TV movie I did. But that was really complicated, and so I found a device used for radio stations that is a sort of a field editing device with a tiny digital display. It was huge because this is years ago, before Pro Tools or any of that stuff. But we did all the playback from that, and so one day Ethan had said to me, this would be great if you could just have two of the choruses in a row instead of the verse here or something like that. And I said, oh, I think I can do that. And this is where sort of my little bit of a music background came in. I was able to make a musical cut and do what he wanted. And once he figured out I could do that, I've done that dozens of times. And that, I mean, that works pretty well. It was a little harder. We had a moment like that on one of the Addams Family movies, and that was Nagra playback. And so if you want to change something like that, you're cutting tape and you're hoping the sync doesn't go crazy. But that works too. But the more movies I've done, the more of them have the music has been live. So on Oh Brother, it was about half and half. But on Llewyn Davis, it was almost entirely live. I think it was the guys in the sweaters were playback, and then there was partial playback for Please Mr. Kennedy. Um, we played back the instrumental they sang live, and then we would mix in the actors we'd already recorded, so that the actor who was about to sing could hear the accompanying voices silently in their head, and then we would just keep swapping that out. And that all comes from having a really good playback operator who could do that sort of thing technically, which is beyond my expertise.
So when you say silent playback, you mean that they have an earpiece and so they can hear it, but you're not picking it up on the mic.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. And sometimes, I think in that scene, sometimes we used a little speaker that was close and it was loud enough that they could hear where they were in the song, but it wasn't so loud that it was over their voice. But usually, as you point out, it's a little tiny earpiece,
Hmm.
though the earpieces are not very loud and they don't sound very good. And then that becomes a whole thing about painting the earpiece. And I don't mean painting it out digitally. I mean physically painting it on the day
Yeah.
to match the
Makeup.
flesh
Yeah.
tone and to put the hair over it and stuff like that. It's so there's a lot of ways of doing that, but but all those things go away when you have an actor like Oscar. He has a rhythm sense. Like a clock. He's a musician, and he can do multiple takes and multiple angles and have everything pretty much all be cuttable, which is the
Hmm.
whole reason for playback to start with is to maintain tempo and pitch so that you can cut in between takes.
But you're basically trying not to have what you're playing back predominant in the track, right? Because if you could, you'd want them clean, but sometimes you've got to use a speaker, right?
Right, and the nice thing about playing back the instruments, but recording the vocals live, is that if there's bleed from the instruments, it's okay because you're going to mix the instruments in with the exact same track full
Right.
up, and so you can have a little bit of bleed and it's fine. You know,
Hmm.
less is better, but you can get away with a lot if you're just doing that. So I like to work that way because it gives you a lot more flexibility, and you get a great performance from people because they're really singing. And I can usually tell when I'm watching a movie if they're singing live or they're not. It's just that they look
Hmm.
different, they breathe differently, and some actors, even when they're singing to playback, sing full out and give a full performance, but a lot of them don't. They hear the music,
Yeah.
and so they're not trying to make it sound right because it already sounds right in the room.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I was very impressed on how did you approach then, say the scene in Folsom Prison and Walk the Line with Joaquin, doing that scene in the prison because it seems so spontaneous and like I know we work with Joaquin. He can be quite kind of like unexpected in what he's going to do. That's the way he performs. But
That was the movie that they gave me the most prep time. They were going to scout for 2 weeks, and so I went on the scout for a few days, and then it became apparent that we'd be much better off spending our time working on the playback scenes. And Joaquin had rehearsals every day at his house, and we would go there and we would do just a regular music rehearsal, and they would play the song, live, and then we would have them do a couple of takes with the earwigs in to playback so they get used to doing that. And we did that for basically all the songs. And it was like
oh
it was
really?
like 2 weeks of rehearsals. So they were kind of a relatively tight band when we started. And Joaquin had been in the recording studio and he was so deep in the character and in the performance that he could do it in a million different circumstances. And we recorded as much of that with live vocals as we could. We did some of it without any playback. The Folsom Prison one was really interesting because one of the things that looks great in that scene, we had these giant playback monitors because we had a big crowd there, and and they were screaming and so forth, and so we had to have the music really loud over them. About halfway through the song, at one point, one of the speakers actually caught on fire because it had been playing so loud. You know, we had to, they finished the song, which was amazing. And I felt really bad about it. I went to Joaquin and I said, God, I'm so sorry that happened. And I hope that didn't, throw your performance. He said, that was great. That was like the most rock and roll thing ever. And he was thrilled. But,
Yeah.
but the band in the middle of the song just picked it up and kept playing and did the song the rest of the way through live. So
Wow.
that was great. And we did a lot of stuff with him, the little things that he's doing, in the Army base and other places. That was all live. The hardest scene was, he goes into the recording studio and he does a couple of songs. And so we had to, tie all the songs together. We had to set the timing between them, and some of them were live and some of them were playback. And it was really complicated. And I got lucky because Matt Andrews, the playback guy, had also been a studio engineer for T-Bone, the music producer, and so he knew the stuff really well. And since the tracks were coming to us like the night before, Matt would be in the hotel room and he would be bouncing from 24 tracks to, or 48 tracks to whatever his playback system was on set, which is usually 8 tracks or less. So he was really familiar with all of that stuff, and he could just on the fly turn instruments on and off, change the playback. He overdubbed, a guitar part that the guitar player said, "This is how I want to play it." So he did the overdub, so the guy would be hearing his own track, and
Wow.
that was great all the way through.
And are there situations where there's playback and then there's dialogue and then there might be playback again? And is his job to turn off the playback and then start it up at the right time
Yeah, and
within a take?
there was a scene that early on, there's a couple of concerts, I think one of where he meets June's performing with him, and there's a MC that comes out, and there's playback, and there's another band, and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes the director can cue or they want to cue, but usually what happens is the director pokes the first AD, and that's like there's like a half a second lag, and then the AD calls on the radio to the PA, and the PA pokes the playback guy, and that just never works. And so we just learn the timing and do it, because it's just part of the performance, and you have to judge it and go for it.
Well, it worked. It was really good.
It worked, and and again, I think we could have done that whole movie live, and it would have worked because Joaquin was really on top of things, just like Oscar was.
Yeah, I mean, it really felt like it was. I mean, felt so spontaneous, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was good.
And it was good that we did, because Joaquin apparently spent, as I understand it, he spent like a year with T-Bone learning the music and performing the music and getting his voice in the right register. And when the movie was over, I spoke to him a few months afterwards, and he could not get to those notes again. So it's really
Wow.
important to get them at the time.
Yeah,
Mm-mm.
yeah. So you live in Nashville and not LA. Does that mean it's possible to live anywhere and work? Because some people think, oh, I got to live in LA.
It's really possible to live anywhere and not work. What's
Oh yeah, LA and not work. It's very possible. I
Yeah.
tell you now. Anyway.
It's again, I've been lucky because I've traveled for jobs, and some of them I put myself up early in my career, and now most of the people I work with are willing to put me up. And it wouldn't help me to work in LA because I've done a lot of movies in Los Angeles, but I've done more
Mhm.
movies outside in New Mexico, in New York, in
Yeah.
New Orleans. And so if I was an Angelino, they would have had to put me up anyway. So they might as well put me up from Tennessee. And there's a contractual difference for LA hires and non-LA hires that comes into play. And I kind of my deal is based on being an LA hire, even though I don't live there, and that works out
Mhm.
pretty well. But I like living here. It's relatively inexpensive, and it makes it easier. Where I go, it's sort of the same thing. I'm on location everywhere, including Los Angeles.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've been very active in the union over the years. I wonder what do you think the biggest issues are today? What's happening in the industry that you think needs to be dealt with?
Well, there's a lot of issues. I think one of the issues, which everybody's familiar with, is that the budgets are getting smaller and the schedules are getting shorter. And so the number of hours that people work is sometimes just unconscionable, particularly in episodic television. And, that comes along also with other things like, having so few hours of rest after the day's work. Oftentimes they don't want to feed the crew anymore because it takes time. I'm dealing with that on a movie here right now that, it's the middle of winter. The daylight hours are 9 or 10 hours a day, and they want to shoot every minute of it. So
Mhm.
that works for some crew people, but for other ones, the camera operator, the assistants, the sound
Mhm.
department, they can't take a half an hour and walk away. So
Mm.
either they eat at their car or they don't eat at all. So that problem is getting worse and worse. And rates hadn't really kept up with inflation, and that was the big issue with the IA negotiations last year. And fortunately, the studios found their way to a fairly significant pay hike, but it was not enough to make up for years of stagnation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
Mhm.
those issues. But, the big problem now is there's just not enough work, and
Mm.
and there's a structural problem also with incentives, which is that productions want to go where the incentives are best, and so you might have a huge crew base someplace, and then suddenly one day the next state over is 5% more, and so all the shows go there, and those people are out of work, and the people in that new state are struggling because this is not the level of work they've had to deal with before, or it's another
Mm-hmm.
country, and so that's a problem that hasn't been resolved yet. Is the way the work keeps moving around.
Mm.
Yeah. Any advice to somebody starting out that wants to or is interested in sound, wants to get into sound and in film in particular?
Um,
Don't
At
do
this
it.
time,
yeah,
Keith,
that's my
point.
yeah, my typical advice is what else you want to do. But
Yeah.
uh,
What would you have done? Is there anything else you'd have done when you were starting out?
well, again,
I always wanted to be a meteorologist, and I sometimes wish I had been.
well, and you end up being that now because you're always, I just see you
Well,
on
there
set.
you
You're all
are, yeah,
looking at the
right.
sky all day long.
Yeah, right. Yeah, true.
What is that cloud going to do?
Yeah, right.
I thought in my college days, I thought I was going to be a firefighter. I worked for a fire department for 5 or 6 years. I became a paramedic. I certainly went to a lot of car accidents and a number of structured fires, and I thought that's what I was going to do.
Oh, wow.
And when I left school, I went to school in Ohio. When I came back to Tennessee, the certification process was totally different, and I would have had to start all over again. And I was offered a job in Ohio as a firefighter paramedic, and I could have been doing that, and I probably would have liked it for a few years, and I probably would have been retired 20 years ago.
Hmm.
But it's in many ways it's the same work. What we used to, my friend Steve-O would always say about airplane pilots, it's hours and hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror and panic. And
Yeah.
that's what firefighting is like. You're working a long shift,
Yeah.
and you're sitting around, you're looking for things to do, and then suddenly you're half in and out of a car that's on fire. And filmmaking is exactly the same thing. You're sitting there, you're waiting for stuff to happen. The other departments are working,
Right.
and then suddenly it's your time, and you look down, and your tape recorder's on fire, or the reel has come off, or it's always something. And then you just
Probably a little less dangerous than firefighting, especially from the experience people have had in LA the last few weeks.
well, that's certainly true. That's certainly true. Although on the other
Yeah.
hand, there's Betsy, and one does not want to be on Betsy's wrong side.
Betsy, the AD, I must point out, who's quite actually
Yeah,
lovely, but yes.
No, I love
Talking about terror.
Betsy's a really good friend, and I loved working with her. But I would say something to her like, I don't know how this happened, but there's just been this short, and all my equipment's not working anymore, and I don't know how to fix it. And we're 1,000 miles from a place where they can fix it. And she says, "Oh, well, you think you'll be ready in 5 minutes?" And I say, "Okay." And then somehow 5 minutes later, it's all working. But that's just the nature of the business. You find
Yeah.
a way to do stuff. So it's not a job for everybody. I really it's never what I talk to a lot of film students, and it's never what they're expecting.
Hmm.
And I think what my advice to people, getting back to that question, is try to work on movies. Maybe it's a no budget movie, maybe it's a movie with a friend, maybe you're shooting it with your phone, whatever. But try to work on it, because a lot of the stuff that you learn doing that is the same stuff that you learn professionally. The difference is the number of people who are there and the kind of equipment you have. And certainly in the sound recording world, I mean, I recorded a scene in Llewyn Davis on the recorder that I'm using now here to record this, which is a pocket recorder. It cost a couple $100, and that scene was fine. So it's not really the tool that you use; it's what you do with it. And so
Mm.
you learn with whatever you've got, and then when you get an opportunity with something with more tracks, or better quality or a higher quality microphone, then it adds to it. But it's the process is very similar. So if people if they go out and they make movies, they'll learn how to make movies, and either they'll like it or they won't, because it's actually, ironically, the lower the budget, the harder the work. And if you're doing television, and a lot of people prefer, they say, I really want to do features and not do television. Television's 10 times harder than feature films. And so as you work your way up through different kinds of production, you suddenly realize that when you're at the peak of your career, the work is so much easier than it was when you're getting started. That's been my experience.
Yeah.
Well, good.
Very good.
Thank you,
It's been
Peter.
a great conversation.
It's been really interesting.
you.
Yeah.
No, I've enjoyed it. I didn't get around to talking about the Cinema Audio Society, which I'm part of, and I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of the union. But we'll have that conversation, next time around.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, but I think it was good what you said about the industry and the outstanding points. I mean, I think it's a whole conversation to go deeper into the other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to comment on, I don't know if it needs to be said now, but this idea of, you spoke to this when I was at the talk you gave here in Nashville, this idea of being nervous before you shoot all the time. And all I want to say about that is that everybody I know who's really good at their job, generally, they're sleepless the night before, they're worried all the time. And I think that's what sort of keeps you on your toes and makes you do a good job.
Yeah, great. No, that's a really good point about being nervous. I think that's a big good point.
Well, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Peter.
you. And again, it's a pleasure to talk to you. And I'll see you.
Hopefully we'll see you soon.
See you on the next book tour.
See you down the road. Yeah.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.